At the start of this year, I resolved to learn more about esports. I started with Call of Duty League and Overwatch League, as they had franchising that I was familiar with as a conventional sports fan. The coronavirus pandemic has since snuffed out conventional sports in most of the world, so my learning of esports has since been accelerated. I have been insanely fascinated by the things I've learned since diving into the vast esports well of dynamics and knowledge. I want to make a disclaimer that I'm very new to esports, so there will be significant gaps in my knowledge, and this video will not be a full-on detail-for-detail comprehensive look, since I'm definitely not qualified to speak on those terms. More of a summary of the findings of a newcomer. Anyway, I hope you guys can bear with me being a greenhorn as I delve into the history of esports in East Asia. Now, I chose East Asia because that region has seemed to make esports its domain. In the world of sports, different sports are kind of monopolized in terms of money and quality of play in certain regions. For example, in soccer, Europe and South America rule. In hockey, North America and Russia. Cricket, South Asia has made that sport its own, and Oceania has rugby. You get my point, basically. In conventional team sports, East Asia doesn't seem to have a sport it excels at over others. Now, baseball and soccer are big deals there, but they lag significantly behind other regions. And soccer itself is still a growing sport there as we speak. But in the relatively new landscape of esports, the industry of professional gaming has become a behemoth in East Asia, particularly mainland China and South Korea. Although Japan's context is quite different from those former two, esports is still a big deal there, just not in the same way as the others. So to track the beginning of the team esports phenomenon in the East, we need to start in South Korea. It's the late 90s. The Asian financial crisis put the scare in a lot of East Asian economies, and to escape the harsh economic and social realities gripping the region, many Koreans played PC games to forget their woes. People flocked to various internet cafes, and they became a social space for recreation, distraction, and socialization. The first game that sparked a sporting explosion was StarCraft, which quickly developed a competitive scene in Korea. Korea's Esports Association was created as early as 2000, and they're behind certain achievements like a minimum salary for professional players. South Korea became the first country in the world to recognize esports gamers as athletes, which began the process of esports pros gaining recognition on par with, or sometimes even greater than, baseball and soccer stars. The Korean Esports Association enjoys support by the government, and South Korea actually has been broadcasting esports on TV for about 20 or so years, something that's only starting to blossom now as an idea in North America. South Korea has since achieved a few milestones in esports history. South Korea saw the construction of the first ever esports stadium in Yongsan in 2005. There are even plans for 5 new esports arenas by 2022. South Korea also supposedly had the first ever esports academy, Game Coach, where players can hone their skills to become pros. In the 2010s, League of Legends and Overwatch have taken the nation by storm. League of Legends is the #1 esport in South Korea in terms of player base and viewership, with several champion teams in the LPL and even more extremely skilled players. Overwatch, though much newer, has quickly risen to have a seriously large player base in casual settings and a plethora of incredible pros in the Overwatch League. They also have a team in Seoul, the Seoul Dynasty. These days, esports pull in sponsors from major Korean corporations such as Samsung and SK Telecom. Now, mainland China has a similar development to South Korea in terms of esports, but with a few unique aspects of its own. The internet became available to the Chinese public around 1997, and soon after, StarCraft also gained a foothold there. Now, you can argue that what pushed China towards its current esports state was the ban on foreign consoles from 2000 to 2015. This pushed most gamers to the PC scene, where games like Dota, Counter-Strike, and later League of Legends would really attract the nation. Another thing is that Chinese gamers have grown up in the era of the one-child policy. Therefore, multiplayer gaming was a very popular way to interact and socialize with others. People packed internet cafes, and those gamers would go on to forge the future of Chinese esports. China's Esports Association was founded by the players who popularized the competitive scene of StarCraft a few years prior, and in 2003, esports was recognized by the government as a legitimate sport. Since then, the Chinese government has pumped in tons of money into the esports scene. But it's nonetheless had a rocky relationship with gaming in China. The state attempts to regulate the amount of games played by players and even sends people with supposed gaming addictions to reformation camps. Yet at the same time, the Chinese government and the rising Chinese corporations such as Tencent and Alibaba saw the enormous potential if they could just control the scene. Instead of fight the rising tide of esports in China, they decided to facilitate it, which has created this contradictory relationship in which the state suppresses gaming, but at the same time contributes to its growing popularity by providing it with the funding, recognition, and infrastructure to thrive on the world stage. In 2008, a symbolic gesture indicated a massive change in the Chinese sporting scene, as two esports players carried an Olympic torch from Hainan to Beijing. Looking at things today, China apparently makes up for about 57% of the global esports audience. In 2017, the League of Legends finals was held in front of a crowd of 40,000 in China. Now, the most popular games in the Chinese esports scene are mostly the same as South Korea. You know, League of Legends and Overwatch, and there's actually 4 teams in the Overwatch League. The Chengdu Hunters, the Shanghai Dragons, Guangzhou Charge, and the Hangzhou Spark. However, Dota 2 reigns supreme in China, but it's worth noting that League of Legends does not lag too far behind. Now, in both of those games, there are a myriad of brilliant Chinese players and Chinese-based teams that succeed in both games' official leagues. Also, surprisingly, mobile PUBG has a strong foothold in China, as mobile gaming is, by the numbers, the largest gaming market in China. Looking towards the future, we could potentially see esports at the Asia Games in 2022. And apparently, Chinese entertainment corporation Tencent is planning to build an esports town/theme park, which may be the first of its kind. Esports is now being added into the lexicon of educational institutions, with esports courses being included in schools, and some universities even offering majors in esports from around 2006 or so. So now you may be thinking, you said this video is about East Asian esports, but you haven't even talked about Japan. What about them? Well, the easy answer would be that it doesn't have a scene to speak of, but that's not necessarily true. Although Japan actually has the oldest tradition of esports in Asia. Now that takes place in the form of fighting games. See, since the 80s, arcade culture has been quite the phenomenon in Japan. Companies like Nintendo, Taito, and Sega invested their time and efforts into making gaming at the arcade a quality experience. While console gaming has superseded arcade gaming basically everywhere in the world, the arcade scene in Japan offers the strongest resistance today to the new forms of gaming. Furthermore, regardless of whether you still go to them or not, arcades hold a significant cultural and historical importance there. These settings are where fighting games first found their feet in a competitive sense. Games like Street Fighter, Tekken, Streets of Rage, and Virtua Fighter kicked off a burgeoning competitive scene worldwide that has since come to include games like Super Smash Bros., Mortal Kombat, Marvel vs. Capcom, and Dragon Ball FighterZ. And a good amount of the world's greatest fighting game players are Japanese. So there's definitely a taste for esports in a general sense. It's more of a case of one sport dominating over others. Like how rugby in New Zealand is so far ahead of every other sport. Now, there are a few supposed reasons why team esports has not seen a rise in Japan as it did in its East Asian neighbors. The first is that Japan definitely has the strongest console presence of any nation in Asia, particularly for Sony and Nintendo consoles. 2 of the world's big 3 consoles were created in Japan, while also a majority of team esports rely on PC gaming to thrive, and that's a relatively small market in Japan compared to the others. Furthermore, the most popular games in Japan tend to be single-player RPGs, so there isn't much of an appetite for MOBAs in games of that nature. There's also esports' association with gambling, which also hinders its progress in Japan, since Japan has some pretty stringent anti-gambling laws. And that also apparently keeps prize pools somewhat lower there. Additionally, let's take into consideration that Nintendo hasn't really pitched into the development of an esports scene in Japan, as they're one of the few corporations centered around gaming and entertainment that hasn't totally bought into the esports phenomenon. And it would be a bit of an understatement to say Nintendo has an influence in Japan, so their lack of involvement has played its part, I would say. There still is a growing awareness of esports. There's a growing League of Legends scene there, with the league operating since 2014, and other teams in other games such as Rainbow Six, CSGO, and Splatoon 2. So this whole section of the video isn't to say that there are no esports in Japan. It's just developed very differently. It's like a virtual version of baseball being the primary sport in Japan and Korea, until recent decades where other sports have now arisen to challenge them. Think of it like that. Well, I hope my video was interesting. I'm definitely enjoying esports so far, and I'm very glad that most esports leagues have continued throughout this terrible crisis we're currently in. The one good thing of this entire crappy situation right now is that it has accelerated my learning of esports, and I hope to continue learning in the foreseeable future. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.